sort of trying to define the particular problem that is emerging that's creating these perceived negative outcomes of this other player ruined the game maliciously, when in actuality it's probably just a mismatch in card evaluation.
Distraction makers.
Let's talk about pub stomping, because I feel like this is an issue in the casual community of Commander that has been massively overblown. So first, let's talk about, let's describe what pub stomping is, so that if anybody's sort of not in the know, they'll be able to follow along with what we're talking about. So we'll describe what it is, we'll talk about why we think it's a myth, and then we'll talk about where the need for labeling something like pub stomping is coming from in the game, and whether or not that's a good or a bad thing for Commander or a game system generally.
So pub stomping is when someone is deliberately going to your local game store or participating with a pod of other Commander players and playing a significantly higher powered deck in order to beat the other players. The key word here is deliberately going and doing this.
Yeah, and it's something I think that can happen outside of Commander, obviously, right? You could have someone who just has a much greater depth of game knowledge than the players that they're playing against, but they're putting themselves into an environment where they are using that game advantage, or that game knowledge as an advantage against players that they know do not know as much as them, and they're playing deliberately in a way to just win without helping those other players along, or, making sure everybody's having a good time. So, right, like you said, the key word here is deliberate, right? It's someone who is purposefully doing this. Something that we need to understand about a situation being deliberate or not, if we look at Hanlon's Razor, what it says is that we should first attribute something to ignorance before we attribute it to malice. And pub stomping, generally speaking, is bestowing malice upon somebody else's actions when this sort of outcome emerges.
Yeah.
So,
which is a possibility, but
sure,
we're making an argument that it is not as common as people say it.
Yeah. That particular outcome, that this particular pub stomping outcome is actually from a mismatch in game knowledge rather than intentionally using one's game knowledge advantage to beat other players. Another concept that we should discuss briefly is something that I was introduced to by the magician James Randi. He spent a lot of years trying to demystify a lot of the sort of psychic industry. And one thing he came to was this idea of describing psychics as eyes closed or eyes open, where eyes closed means that they're psychics that truly believe that they have some kind of psychic power, and then eyes open are psychics who know that they do not have any kind of psychic power, but they are doing these sort of psychic things to extract money from people. When we're talking about eyes closed versus eyes open, we're not talking about it as in necessarily as negative of a connotation, but I think the idea that someone can enter into some kind of experience knowing that there's something outside of that experience that's influencing their behavior versus someone who doesn't know that, I think is important here. So why do we think Commander in particular suffers from this so much more than other formats of Magic?
Some of it might be how the actual format started. It started more casual, not official support. And it was very much pushed as a sort of social, non-competitive format. And as that has sort of grown and more people have played, there's been these sort of social norms that have been established. But one thing that happens when the sort of format has grown is that there's been more and more players that are sort of crossing over into each individual pod. So you might have some sort of a play group of your players that all get together really, really well. You all decide what you believe to be the, agreed upon, this is what we're going to be playing in our pod. We're not going to do 2-card combos or infinite turns or whatever. And then you go to your local game store and you try to play with other people. And those people came from a different pod that had different evaluations of what they considered to be fair or legal or allowed or whatever.
In other formats, this happens less often. And part of the reason why is when you sort of gather at a game store to play in other formats, at least throughout the history of when I was playing Standard, when you gather at a game store to play other formats, you're coming together under the assumption that people are playing competitively. There used to be a split between league play and tournament play with there was Monday leagues at my local game store. And then there's also Friday Night Magic, which was the big, it's a tournament setting. And so when players would get together to play in these events, there was no expectation of your opponent having the same kind of card evaluation skills that you do. It was, we're arriving with the same intent. We all understand that the goal is to win. And so we're not going to attribute winning to malice. Right. We're just going to say, oh, they're sort of better at this than I am.
There are situations that someone could bring like a, considered a suboptimal deck, right? So there's plenty of people over time that they know that they're not playing the best deck. Maybe they even think that they're playing the best deck, but or a good deck. But it's themed after a particular something, or they gave themselves the sort of deck building challenge to make something in a particular way. But most of the time, it's very clear whether your deck is good or not good because you are winning or losing. There's not malice to be attributed, like you're saying, because the only goal overall is to win the game. If someone is making their deck for other reasons, then they shouldn't be surprised if someone else is going against them that's not doing that, that is just trying to win the game.
Part of where this like pub stomping idea comes from is from someone who is playing to win in an event where someone else might not be, but also understanding what playing to win means is subjective within the scope of Commander. Right. So part of what is happening is that the player base has become so fractured that individual metas are formed with a 4-player pod, or somewhere around 4 players, and oftentimes those players have come up together, learning to play Magic together, and they're sort of finding their own ecosystems of content creators that are reinforcing the opinions that they have about whether or not a card is good or whether or not a playstyle is good. And it's not to say, again, this isn't like a value judgment. We're not saying that this is good or bad. We're saying that this is kind of an observed outcome that's leading to these experiences of when I go outside of my ecosystem, I'm suddenly unable to have a game that I am finding enjoyable because there's a mismatch in what our separate metas were that now when they come together doesn't work.
Yeah, this isn't an just to add on to what you're saying, this isn't an evaluation of what we are considering to be right or wrong of how you experience the game, as much as we're talking about this from a designer standpoint of like when, based on what the game systems are and the culture around this sort of game, this is just a natural outcome for this is how we got to this point, I guess.
Yeah, and we'll get into like pros and cons of this idea a little later. We're sort of trying to define the particular problem that is emerging that's creating these perceived negative outcomes of this other player ruined the game maliciously, when in actuality, it's probably just a mismatch in card evaluation. One thing we've talked about before is like sort of when we go to design a commander deck, from a designer's perspective, we're entering into that with our eyes open to that we are making a suboptimal strategy, and we're doing so purposefully because it matches the play group that we're going to go play with.
What got us talking about this initially was some of the recent Tarkir reveals, and something that I was noticing when I was looking at content creators and I was looking at people, I follow on Twitter or whatever, is that there's a lot of differences, I guess. There's a lot of debate on what is or isn't considered like a crazy good card. A couple notable ones are like Dracogenesis and Call the Spirit Dragons. Very big, exciting, cool cards. Something I thought was really interesting is that there's a lot of people that were talking about how good these cards are. And I've been in CEDH land, and I was looking at these cards and I was like, these cards are not good. Like technically they're not good, right? If you evaluate them. That being said, if someone's making like a dragon exclusive deck, right, and they are limiting themselves to, well, I want to make a dragon themed archetype deck, then those cards probably would be good for that type of a deck. Going back to your eyes open, eyes shut concept, is that I don't know. I think there's a lot of players that don't maybe immediately recognize that by putting yourself in that sort of box from the beginning of I'm making a dragon themed deck, that you are deliberately putting yourself in a suboptimal position, and that your deck will naturally just not be as good as it potentially could be unless you broke out of that sort of theme or archetype. And so that's where other players, a pub stomper, quote unquote, could come in that maybe is evaluating things in a way outside of just limiting themselves to these archetypes or these themes that you might get very excited about, but they're excited about these other things. Maybe they're excited about different play patterns. So they're not afraid to play a game that maybe has Turgid in it or whatever. Maybe Turgrid's too much, but discard, right? Any sort of discardability, milling, stuff that players generally frown upon in a casual table as a negative play pattern. And they're more willing to go and explore those things.
So to me, what this shines a pretty big spotlight on is a pro and a con for game designers generally, right? Which is that players themselves have now segmented the meta to make it so that different levels of powerful cards are playable in different play groups. So previously, when we look at something like standard, modern, whatever, are all ways to like segment the totality of Magic's cards so that different cards can be playable, right? We have different sets of metas that make it so different cards are viable in those environments. But when we look at the way that Commander works, a lot more cards are potentially viable, but they're split amongst millions of disparate play groups that will never see each other.
Yeah.
But what's interesting about that is that, okay, within these individual play groups, a card like Draco Genesis could be incredible. But then if those groups try to then play against each other, that's when we end up in this sort of pub stomping territory.
Yeah. I feel like a lot of the pros in tandem are going to have sort of a con on the other side. Everything's going to have like a good and a bad side. And so, if the first big pro that everyone probably goes to is like, well, there's a larger pool of cards that you can use. While that is good, it also means that if there's more players playing Commander, then suddenly there's more cards that need to be designed for in standard sets. And we're seeing that right now where Commander designed cards are very pervasive in these sets that do not traditionally have Commander cards, Nadu being a most notable one in Modern.
Yeah, there's actually something interesting that Mark Rosewater said about this, where he was basically saying that there was room in the booster pack for different styles of play in this way, that like there's a section of the booster pack, like there's only a really small subset of cards that will get played at the most competitive levels in Standard. And then like when Commander comes in, now we have, there's more room here for these cards that could be played in different Commander groups. Now, I do think that Standard players or competitive-minded players tend to look at that. I guess I should say players that don't play Commander end up looking at this as like an opportunity cost for them, because like, well, that could have been a card that wasn't for Commander, but now that is a card that's for Commander. Therefore, it's taking away from cards that would be playable in, say, Standard.
The usual split previously was it was either Standard or it was Draft. And now, or any sort of limited format. And now, yeah, like you're saying, that now there's a sort of third category of Commander. Personally, when I've actually like drafted, I've noticed a couple of times when drafting on like Magic Arena that there's a few cards that I'm like, this feels like a Commander card that I'm like drafting right now. That doesn't really feel like it's going to be necessarily super viable for this thing that I'm doing right here. Maybe there's a world that I could have drafted into making that function, but
yeah. Well, we see some sort of negative, I think, consequences because of that. Is specifically in limited with things that are much more swingy and powerful than they otherwise would be. But I don't know. I haven't played a whole lot of draft recently, so I don't know if that's still as big of a problem as it was. So there's an interesting problem that's arising here, which is that I think like as a newer game creator or somebody who's making a game that does not exist, does not have a player base, this would probably be a fairly large problem for you, which is that players would have a hard time finding other players to play your game. But because Magic has gotten to such a level of popularity that groups of 4 can form individually rather than needing to like come to a particular hub to form those play groups. I think this in some ways has become quite a large advantage for Magic specifically, in that, like we said, there's a whole lot more cards that become sort of playable in those environments that otherwise wouldn't be if you had everybody gathering into the same, like a much more homogenized spot. But then the problem comes back in when Magic is like, well, we're going to have like a Magic Con or something where everybody can like, everybody come and play Commander. And you get a bunch of mismatches of card evaluation skills, different metas, different understandings of the game, and you're trying to get all those players to play together in the same environment.
Right. You get basically a large portion of people that are talking about Commander cards and talking about their Commander decks saying like, oh, these new cards are super good. They're really, really good. And then you hear most of the CEDH people that are playing at like hyper competitive level that like aren't talking about any of those cards.
Right. Well, and part of that is a little bit of the hype cycle, like online hype cycle of like, oh, new set's coming out, let's talk about it. And you could kind of be in a situation where you can assume that any given card someone could see as powerful, right? Like not any, but like there's a wide range of cards that you could say, oh, look how good this is. Look how good this is. Sure. And we see different channels that specialize in that kind of thing. But like generally speaking, if you're evaluating a card based on the systems of the game, there's not that many cards that would be perceived as all that powerful.
For Commander at its highest level.
Well, any format specifically, but yeah, Commander in terms of like, if we're all on the same page. I do think one of the bigger problems here that comes up is with how players acquire cards.
This is somewhat in line with what you're saying about there's an opportunity for cards when you're opening a booster pack for it to be standard legal cards that players that play standard are interested in, players that play limited are interested in, and players that play commander are interested in. The problem with this, though, is that if the sort of commander culture on average, or the casual culture of your pod tends to lean away towards certain play patterns, then suddenly it means that even though you might be getting something that is like a commander coded card, or a card that could be good in commander, the majority of the time you wouldn't play it because maybe it mills or has discard or it's a stacks piece or something like that. And so you end up, I think, pushing players away from being able to participate in opening booster packs and encouraging more and more people to buy singles.
There's already a question of whether booster packs make sense if the game isn't being drafted anyway, then it sort of just becomes a loot box. But like if there isn't like some kind of mechanical functionality to why things are distributed in a booster pack. But yeah, you end up in this situation where, I've opened this really cool card from a booster, and if I introduce it to my particular ecosystem, my particular meta, it's going to shift the metagame to an extreme that means that my choice is everybody else has to shift along with me or I don't get to play this card. And that does not feel particularly good.
No, and it's unfortunate because, I've been there in times that I think I've even humored the idea of saying, I want to play like a Turgid deck at some point. And I've had friends in our play group that are like, I will not play with you if you play a deck like that.
We're going to do I think we're going to do an episode specifically on Turgid at some point.
On Turgid?
She's special.
Well, you wanted to make Tiny Bones.
Yeah, I can't. Yeah. No. Okay, so what are I guess sort of our final takeaways here with this idea?
Commander's changing, people. Now we're getting the sweaties coming in. Well, no, I think that a lot of this ended up coming from a culture clash, right? You ended up getting a lot of players that they felt like maybe the only way that they could interact with the system, or not the only way they could interact with Magic, but maybe it's just someone that leans towards competitive or better game knowledge, card evaluation, is starting to go and get involved with these more casual pods that are learning from surrounding content creators that are pushing this sort of social narrative, to play the game for reasons outside of just winning, which I think is admirable and totally fine, but there's other reasons that people play the game. And I think that we're seeing a big culture clash from these two groups sort of meeting. And I think the majority of people that are holding the narrative of what Commander is as a format and what the game is are the people that are talking about it being social, being non-combative. It's you're working together, right, to have a good experience. And I think that because of that, we're able to sort of, villainize.
I do think that's partially where this has come from. It's like in this motivation to preserve what you're perceiving as the intended experience of Commander. Right. When, I guess, but the problem when it becomes the premier format is that that comes with the territory at that point. Is that if everyone is now playing this as the way to play Magic, some people are going to be playing it competitively. I will say, to me, it might mean that the bracket system is probably just doomed to fail generally. And the reason why is because the people, we said this before in our bracket video, but the people who really need the bracket system are the people who are least likely to understand it. In that the people who do not have the game knowledge to evaluate whether or not something is a particular bracket they're the people who are perceiving others as pub stomping them, right? They're the ones who have this mindset of, this other person is beating me because they want to hurt me. They want to break the idea of what Commander is, when really it's probably just a mismatch on potentially both ends here of people who don't understand how to find a game that matches up. And so you create a bracket system that says, okay, here's a objective way, theoretically, to measure how powerful one's deck is. The only thing objective about it is the game changers list. So once we get outside of that, now it becomes subjective in terms of okay, well, there's a few explicit rules here that are like, no mass land destruction, no, 2-card combos. There's a few things, but the issue is that anything that's in those gray areas leaves room for misinterpretation. And the people who are going to be misinterpreting somebody else's actions as malice are the people who don't who have a less understanding of game knowledge, right? Where the people who have more understanding of the game knowledge, they might end up in a situation where they're like, well, I didn't intend to hurt somebody's feelings or to make somebody feel bad about the game that they wanted to play. I just wanted to play the game in the way that I understand it. And so the people who are going to be able to actually navigate the bracket system are the people that are now eyes open about their game knowledge so that they know how to change what they're doing to play with people who have less game knowledge.
And
you see what I'm saying? Like, it's such a small sliver of people.
If you enjoyed listening to us talk about Pub Stompers, please feel free to give us a little like and a subscribe, maybe a comment down below. And also, if you want to keep the discussion going, you can join our Discord. You can find a link to that in the description of the video down below.
We'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.